The first sign that something terrible has happened to someone you know is when they don't answer a phone call or respond to a text, especially if it's in their nature to keep in touch. The next step is to ask around and see if anyone has heard from them, and when no one has, someone is usually tasked with going to check on them. They almost always want to believe that everything is fine, making a list of reasons their friend has been silent, but death is usually not at the top of that list. No one ever thinks that they're going to stumble upon a murder. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and if you've never been here before, I am Kimbyrleigha. It's nice to finally meet you. Today's case is not only one from my home state of Florida, which is why I was drawn to it, but it's also one of those cases where your jaw will drop in shock when you figure out what happened and especially who is responsible. Before we get into all the details, I would love for you to give me a moment to thank our sponsor for today, and that is Gab Wireless. If you're a parent that values your kids' or teens' safety, then you're gonna wanna hear about this. If you've never heard of Gab, they make safe smartphones and watches for teens, kids, and tweens. And if you're looking for the perfect holiday gift for your child, they're having a holiday sale right now, so it's the perfect time to check Gab out. If your kid is anything like my now 13-year-old, they want to be able to communicate with you, but also their friends in group chats, video calls, and with text messages. But if you're anything like me as a parent, it can be scary to just hand your child a device not knowing what they could stumble upon. And that is why I got my daughter the Gab 4 Pro phone. There is unlimited talk and text with a Gab Messenger. And this is a premium quality smartphone with a bright, colorful 6.5-inch display, 128 gigs of storage, a selfie and main camera, and the ability to stream clean music on the Gab Music app. But what's different is the Gab phone has no social media apps and no internet browser, but it still has things you want like GPS tracking enabled. You may not know this, but 45% of teens say that social media actually makes them feel sad or depressed. And who knows what they could be exposed to on social media or what music or videos they're looking up. And it's concerning to think about what they can do on their phones now. Well, Gab devices are made with kids and teens in mind, and their goal is to keep them safe but connected. They don't just make phones, they make smartwatches too, and it's everything kids want with the safety and control that parents want as well. My daughter loves listening to music, and the Gab Music app allows her to stream clean music so she can enjoy her favorite songs, and I can be sure that she's not listening to anything I wouldn't want her to hear. You would be surprised at some of the lyrics that I've heard in today's most popular songs. The Gab Music app allows them to listen to those artists, but to cleaner versions. And not only that, there are a ton of third-party apps that I can approve for her to install. It's really simple. I just go to my Gab account online and I can use it to search for a particular app that Shiloh wants. And then I can look through all the warnings before approving it for download. If I'm okay with everything, I click add, and this will add the app right to her Gab device. Gab Messenger also blocks high-risk messages or sketchy content that may contain things that we don't want our kids to be exposed to, like nudity, for example. This app is exclusive to Gab phones. And my favorite part is that I have the companion app on my phone where I can set up different controls and even be alerted to anything questionable before it ever reaches my child's phone, unlike other safe devices that only alert you after something has been accessed. My Gab companion app also tells me how much battery life Shiloh's phone has, and I can check her location at any time. I've been very impressed with the quality of the Gab Phone 4 Pro. It takes great photos, which I know Shiloh loves because she takes hundreds of photos. And it's Mazzie's first Christmas, so I know that Shiloh's gonna use her phone to not only listen to Christmas songs while we trim the tree, but take a bunch of photos of her little sister. I'm telling you, if your child has been wanting a phone or you've been wanting to keep in touch with them with their safety in mind, you have to get a Gab device. It's the gift that will keep giving all year round. Right now, Gab is offering huge discounts on phones and watches to new customers. And the best part, there's no contract required. Just go to gab.com/Kimber to get started. That's Gab, GABB.com/Kimber. gab.com/Kimber. Terms and conditions apply. Thank you so very much to Gab for sponsoring today's video. Now, let me introduce you to Karen Marshall. She was born on March 29, 1949, in Menands, New York, outside of Albany. She was the eldest child in her family, followed by her brother Roy, sister Kim, and baby brother Mark. Her father, Delmar, owned an appliance company, while her mom, who she affectionately referred to as Mommy, dedicated her life to raising their children. The bond between Karen and her younger brother Roy was especially strong. They were close in age and shared countless adventures together. Growing up, Karen and Roy had their fair share of fights and moments of mischief, but Karen would also bribe Roy with promises of a coveted reward, the chance to hang out in her room. This room was a treasure trove for Roy, filled with music boxes and other fascinating items that captivated his curiosity. Her strategy was simple. Karen would offer Roy the privilege of exploring her room in exchange for him doing his chores, but maybe they were her chores. I just thought that was pretty cute. As a young girl, Karen faced challenges, though, due to her speech impediment. She struggled with a stutter, making it very difficult for her to pronounce certain words or sounds correctly. This condition affected her confidence and made her anxious about public speaking and social interactions. When her parents asked the doctors what they should do, their advice would probably be frowned upon today. The doctors told them to make fun of Karen until she stopped. Her parents followed the doctor's orders, but it's no surprise this only made her stutter worse. Poor Karen. But she was resilient. Delmar and Sophia raised their children Catholic and were very strict, especially with their daughters. They told Karen she could not leave home to attend college unless it were a Catholic university. Being the good daughter she was, Karen decided to follow her parents' wishes and enrolled at Nazareth College, a Catholic university in Rochester, New York. Karen decided to study art. She possessed a remarkable talent for creating captivating sculptures which were deemed worthy enough of permanent display within the school. It was during this time that Karen's confidence soared. Although she had struggled with that stutter since childhood, she managed to shake off those fears and conquer her public speaking challenges. Attending college in the late 60s, early 70s, Karen found herself studying at a time the Vietnam War was raging. Being open-minded, she joined other like-minded students in peacefully protesting the conflict. Little did she know that her image was going to appear in the newspaper alongside her fellow picketers. When Karen's conservative Catholic parents discovered her involvement in these demonstrations, they were mortified. Their daughter, the student they had raised with strict values, now found herself at the forefront of a counterculture movement. This sight caused quite a stir in the household. It always seemed that Karen was at odds with her parents. But after she graduated from Nazareth with a Bachelor's of Arts and Science degree, she decided she didn't want to go to her graduation ceremony to get her diploma. She didn't want to walk the stage. Karen was like, the school can just mail it to me. When her mother, who was of course so proud and ready to travel to the school for the big graduation celebration, heard this, she was stunned. Being traditional and old school, Sophia did not approve of Karen's decision to skip her ceremony. She exerted her influence and she guilt-tripped her daughter into attending. Here's what Sophia did. She told Karen that her grandmother had sewed a beautiful white dress for her, specifically for the graduation ceremony, and she threatened that Karen's decision not to walk across the stage in that dress would break her grandmother's heart. Against her own better judgment, Karen succumbed to her mother's demands, and she did attend her graduation ceremony with her class, wearing that dress that her grandma gave her or made for her. We don't really know which one was the truth. However, she still needed to rebel. She had to find a way to express herself. When Karen's name was called, she strut across the stage wearing the white dress, but she had a pair of combat boots underneath her gown. And that made me smile. I really liked learning about Karen. This unexpected footwear choice caught the attention of both the audience and Karen's family. All the other women, of course, were wearing their nicest dress shoes. Her family members were furious, but her brother Roy thought it was hilarious. After graduating, Karen was hired to teach art at an elementary school. She also had the opportunity to work at a psychiatric hospital, where she utilized her artistic abilities to help patients express themselves through art. And during this time, Karen met a guy named Stephen Cruz, whom she would eventually end up marrying. Despite growing up Catholic and attending a Catholic university, Karen had become increasingly disillusioned with the church and its teachings. This led her to decline a church wedding, and you probably could have guessed that this did not sit well with her mother, Sophia. She refused to attend her own daughter's wedding. However, Karen stood by her decision, knowing it reflected her beliefs and her values. After all, it was her big day. Her mother already had her own wedding. It was Karen's turn. Her family never showed up, and that made me sad for her. But having an overbearing mother like Sophia, Karen was happy with her decision and she stood up for herself that day. And at the end of the day, it was about her and Stephen. After they got married, the couple relocated to New Hampshire, where they pretty much embraced the hippie lifestyle, which was pretty popular back then. Karen was cultivating a garden to grow her own food, while her husband worked at a co-op, where they would actually trade their labor for more food. This self-sufficiency enabled them to sustain themselves in a more organic and a natural way, and this trend has come back. It's actually pretty popular nowadays as well. However, despite the initial love and happiness that they shared, Karen and Stephen eventually drifted apart and decided to divorce. When the separation happened, Karen decided not to go back to her maiden name Marshall. Instead, she chose to take her mother's last name, Gregory. This decision was not intended as a slight against her father, but as a way to honor her upbringing and her heritage. And I have to say, it surprised me knowing what we know about Karen and her mom's relationship. But Karen explained to her father that after spending 20 years with his last name, she felt it was time to give her mother's last name a try. And I think that's a really fun way to go about it. My mom's maiden name is DiDomenicus, so I don't think I'm going to go back to that. I haven't even had a chance to change my last name to Johns yet. But let me know if your family have any traditions. Karen's decision to retain her mother's last name represented a new chapter in her life. It symbolized her determination to carve her own path and create her own destiny, separate from her upbringing and any limitations it may have imposed. After her divorce, Karen decided to stay in New Hampshire and was hired to work for a couple different magazines. She worked for a children's magazine and the other one was about computers. This provided her with a fresh start and the opportunity to pursue her passion for working as a graphic designer. She settled into her new role, and Karen made friends with a colleague who shared her interest in sculpting pottery, of all things. Their conversation sparked a connection, and Karen found herself falling for this guy, and hard. It reminds me of that scene from the movie Ghost. I mean, that's all I think about when a couple says they love doing pottery. But Karen's life took an unexpected turn when she decided to not only start dating this guy, but also moving in with her new pottery partner. Let's just call him Sam for clarity. Living with Sam had a profound impact on Karen. She began exploring her culinary skills, experimenting with various recipes and different ingredients. One recipe that caught the attention of her friends and loved ones was her legendary baklava. In addition to cooking, Karen's lifestyle underwent a significant transformation. She started following a vegetarian diet, and this decision aligned with her new values and beliefs. Her passion for cooking also led her to develop a love for the art of aromatherapy. Karen loved cuddling up with her cozy socks on and her cats and enjoying the smells that were flowing through the air. Her brother Roy actually started calling her Miss Whole Wheat and the Queen of the Hippies. They both had a great sense of humor. Karen had thick, long brown hair, olive-toned skin, and mesmerizing blue eyes. Her striking features, combined with her confident demeanor, turned heads wherever she went. However, Karen remained humble and grounded, never letting her beauty overshadow her genuine kindness and her positivity. She just radiated warmth. By January of 1983, Karen was ready for a change. The harsh New England winters had taken their toll on her, and she wanted to relocate to a place where the sun was shining all year round. Although Karen was still close friends with her boyfriend Sam, she decided to end their relationship to pursue her aspirations of moving to a different location. Karen embarked on a journey to Pinellas County, Florida, with her younger brother Mark. Their sibling Kim and her husband were already living there, so they figured that they would give the Sunshine State a try. Karen started working as a waitress at the Garden Restaurant and Bar in downtown St. Petersburg. After moving, Mark eventually decided to go back up north, but Karen embraced the Floridian lifestyle and she stayed. Following Mark's departure, Karen settled into an apartment in Paso Grille Beach with her friend Anita Kilpatrick. They quickly became inseparable and formed a really strong bond as they navigated through their new lives in Florida. Karen's love for the sun grew stronger, and she found herself loving the warmer weather. She immediately fell in love with her new job as well, and on Halloween that year, Karen dressed up as a waitress from the 1950s, complete with a white apron, red lipstick, and a beehive hairstyle. To further enhance her costume, she even spray painted her hair black, leaving a stain on her bathroom wall that lasted for weeks. Living in Pinellas County was a breath of fresh air for Karen, who absolutely loved being outdoors. Florida was so different from living in New York or New England, where she was stuck inside the majority of the year because the weather was so cold. One of Karen's favorite new activities in Florida was riding her bike for miles in the hot summer weather. She would often listen to her favorite reggae group on her portable cassette player. Who remembers these? And she enjoyed the music as she pedaled along. Sometimes her roommate Anita would actually catch Karen in the apartment, dancing and having a great time all by herself while listening to her favorite reggae. Karen wasn't afraid to make a fool of herself. She was confident in who she was, and she didn't mind what others thought of her. Karen possessed many admirable qualities, but her loyalty was one of her defining characteristics. She was a dedicated friend who cherished people that she held close to her heart. One of Karen's pet peeves was actually gossip. She detested any form of negative talk, and she preferred to focus on the positive and uplifting conversations. When Karen moved to Florida, she left behind her friends up north. However, this move did not deter her from her commitment to staying connected with her loved ones. She invested in a new, sleek black telephone specifically for her calls, and Karen's calls were very memorable. She would refer to her friends with affectionate terms like honey and sweetheart. Unfortunately, back then you had to pay for long distance, and her excessive long distance phone calls had her bill racked up. But it was a reflection of her dedication, and she was willing to pay the price to maintain those friendships. Although Karen might not have had a lot of money, she was rich in friendship, as they say. She loved to explore new places, and she was always up for a new adventure. Traveling was actually one of her passions. She dreamed of someday living in Jamaica and teaching art. Something else changed when she moved to Florida. Karen took her safety very seriously. It was different there. She never even locked her doors in New Hampshire. But now, she was always having to remind her sister Kim about the importance of being aware of your surroundings. One night, while at Kim's house, Karen reprimanded her for carelessly just opening the front door without even asking who it was on the other side. She told her, "You have to be more careful," saying, "What if someone came in here and attacked you?" Karen had been protecting her little sister since they slept in the same room as kids, and Kim used to be scared of the dark. She would climb into Karen's bed and sleep with her if she had a bad dream. A few years earlier, in 1977, Karen and Kim had gone together to see a movie called Looking for Mr. Goodbar. It was based on a real-life murder case that happened back in 1973. It was the killing of a New York City schoolteacher, Roseanne Quinn. The movie centered around the young schoolteacher who was stabbed to death in her home by a guy she was seeing that she met at a bar. The storyline deeply impacted Karen, leaving her terrified and concerned about her safety. During one conversation after they watched the movie, Karen shared with Kim her fear of dying violently, like it was depicted in the film. Karen said, "I never want to die like that." It was as though Karen could sense a dark foreshadowing of her own future, as the universe was almost sending her a warning. The chilling events depicted in that movie stayed with Karen. And in March of 1983, Karen met a new guy, David Mackey. And there was just something special between them from the moment they met. Karen couldn't help but feel butterflies in her stomach, but she debated whether or not to give him a call after they exchanged numbers. But ultimately, Karen decided to take the risk, and it turned out to be one of the best decisions she had ever made. David felt the same way for Karen. Her and David's first date was magical, and from that moment on, they knew that they had something special. David later confessed that he did not simply fall for Karen, he plunged. One of the things that drew Karen to David was his passion for martial arts because they both shared a love for the discipline. In addition, David and Karen both had an appreciation for reggae music, and they would often attend concerts together. And those close to Karen quickly took to David as well, appreciating his intelligence and compassionate nature. They believed that he was one of the few people who could keep up with Karen's wit and her sharp humor. David and Karen discussed traveling the world together one day and even possibly getting married. David was a therapist that worked as an administrator of a counseling program for Vietnam veterans at Bay Pines Veterans Administration Medical Center. He dedicated his time to helping veterans struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. His empathy and understanding were remarkable, and Karen admired his ability to connect with those in need. That holiday, Karen went above and beyond to make a special Christmas present for her boyfriend by dedicating weeks to creating a one-of-a-kind reversible patchwork jacket for David. Karen's approach to this jacket's creation was, I would say, unconventional and meticulous. She had no specific plan in mind. She just started, and she wanted to let her inspiration guide her every step of the way. This jacket was unlike anything anyone had seen. It had vibrant colors and zippers in unusual places, and no pattern. And to me, it sounds really cool. To ensure that David experienced the surprise as she intended, Karen refused to let him over her apartment. She was scared he might catch a glimpse of her progress. Karen's roommate, Anita, vividly remembered how Karen would stay up past midnight, diligently sewing away, only to rip out the seam later and start all over again. And this perfectionism and commitment to creating this perfect jacket gave Anita quite a headache, but she knew it would be worth it, and David was thrilled when he got the jacket. Just about 4 months later, he was surprising Karen when he asked her to move in with him in his home in Gulfport, Florida. She had become familiar with Gulfport during her year-long relationship with David, and what attracted Karen so much to this neighborhood was the presence of a neighborhood watch program. It made her feel safe, knowing that there were neighbors looking out for one another, and as a matter of fact, it was one of the first things she noticed when she started coming over to David's house. There was a sign in one of the neighbors' front yards that read, "Warning, this is a Citizens Crime Watch area." Now, I am sure that you have seen one of these signs before in certain neighborhoods where it kind of is meant to deter people from committing crime, since they know that people will be watching. Karen liked that it was a somewhat quiet neighborhood, with a lot of the residents being older. They were retirees that came to Florida from somewhere else, or snowbirds that only lived in their homes in the winter months. Karen and David were among just a handful of younger residents in the neighborhood, and that made them unique. And of course, there was also the fact that Karen was white and David was black. And I'm mentioning this because we're talking about 1984. And even though by the early 80s it was way more acceptable, it was still not as common. And it made the couple stand out, especially in this more conservative area of town where they would still get a few stares or raised eyebrows now and then. But David had already been living in this neighborhood. He felt safe, he felt accepted, and he felt like part of the community. He never had any problems at all with any of the neighbors. The house was quaint and cute. It sat on the northwest corner of 27th Avenue South and Upton Street. And 27th Avenue South was one of the few roads in that neighborhood that was paved with brick, which I thought was pretty interesting. It made me wonder why. I thought it was cool and kind of nostalgic. And every time a car drove by, you could hear a rumble from their tires. In May of 1984, as Karen started to move her belongings into David's home in phases, she bid farewell to her job at the Garden Bar and Restaurant. However, the month marked a significant turning point in her life because she got hired by a new company called Datacom Associates as a graphic artist. This fulfilled her passion for creativity, and her role entailed creating specific drawings that represented complex concepts and helped to explain how something functioned or how it was constructed. This would be something you would find in maybe an instruction manual on how to use a new device that you bought. Karen believed the rest of 1984 held nothing but promise. She'd be living in a new home in a safe neighborhood, she landed her dream job, and she had a thriving relationship with David. That is what makes these cases so sad, because little did Karen know that her hopes and aspirations would never be realized. Darkness lurked, patiently watching and waiting for its opportunity to strike. As Karen continued her preparations to move in with David, she unknowingly was stepping right into a web of danger. The week that Karen began to move her belongings into her boyfriend David's Gulfport home, he had to travel to Providence, Rhode Island for a few days for a conference, and he'd be leaving on Monday, May 21st. Karen drove him to the airport that day. She said goodbye and gave him a hug and a kiss. After saying goodbye to David at the airport, Karen made her way back to the apartment that she shared with her friend Anita in Paso Robles Beach. And there, Karen packed the last of her belongings into her Volkswagen Rabbit. And with every box she filled, Karen's heart grew heavier with the weight of leaving behind a chapter of her life. Before leaving the apartment for the final time, Karen wrote a note for her former roommate and good friend. Karen said in a simple but would be very heartbreaking message, "See you soon. Love, Kay." It had been raining for days, the way that it usually does in the spring in Florida, and Karen was making trips back and forth from her car to David's house the next day on Tuesday, May 22nd. So that evening, it was a nice break when Karen visited her friend, Naverne Covington. She was another artist in her mid-30s like Karen, Naverne was leaving for a trip to Boston the very next day, and she wanted to give Karen her spare key in case there was an emergency. And Karen had also agreed to feed her pets while she was away. Karen arrived around 7:30 p.m., and the friends spent hours talking, just exchanging stories and updating one another on life. Karen shared her excitement over her new job and her move to Gulfport. And as the night drew to a close, Karen thought it was time to say goodbye, especially since it was close to midnight. Karen was pretty tired after moving all day long, and she just wanted to go home, take a shower, and get into bed. She hugged Naverne goodbye, and she held her really tightly. Karen said, "I'm really going to miss you." And Naverne laughed. She told Karen, "I'm only going to be gone a week." But Karen said, "I know, but I'm really going to miss you." It's eerie that Karen seemed to understand that she would never see Naverne again because, for some reason, she held onto her even tighter than usual that night. And then she hopped into her car and drove off. David called Karen twice from his hotel room that night while he was in Rhode Island, but he received no answer. And that's probably because, at that point, Karen was still at Naverne's. This was the 80s. There were no cell phones. But David grew increasingly worried when he called again the following day on Wednesday and still received no response. It was really unlike Karen to not answer her phone, but he also knew she started a new job recently, and maybe she was just caught up in moving and working. But David decided to make sure, so he contacted Anita, Karen's former roommate, to inquire about whether she had heard from her. And unfortunately, Anita revealed she had not heard or seen Karen since her last trip over to their apartment to get the rest of her belongings. However, she told David that maybe he should check with her sister Kim, because Karen and Kim kept in touch on a regular basis, and she had just seen her a few days before on May 19th. Kim, her husband, and her daughter lived about 45 minutes away in Dunedin, but since it wasn't uncommon for them to visit together, David figured they would check with Kim. He hoped that Karen would be with her, but again, David discovered that Kim had not been in touch with her sister either. David was busy at work at his conference and still believed that Karen could just be busy settling into her new job and her new home. But that day, David decided to contact Datacom Associates, Karen's new employer, and he did it during business hours so he could hopefully catch Karen while she was working. And that's when Karen's supervisor informed David that Karen had not been at work at all. And this news concerned David. Karen would never miss a day at work at a new job, especially without informing someone that she wouldn't be there. After he was finished with his work for that day, he began contacting friends of Karen's, and once again he spoke to Anita around midnight, since he still could not reach Karen. And when she heard that Karen had missed work without calling in, Anita became really concerned. But David told Anita that he would try Karen again around 7 a.m. That way he could catch her before she went to work. And if he still didn't get an answer, he was going to get in contact with one of his neighbors in Gulfport and have them go check on Karen because something did not seem right. While David was doing that, Anita took it upon herself to contact the local hospitals and police stations in Pinellas County to see if any people matching Karen's description were under arrest or under their care. But unfortunately, Anita was unsuccessful in her search. So, at 7 a.m. on Thursday morning, David contacted his neighbor, Amy Bressler, who lived a couple houses down from him on Upton. He asked Amy if she could just look out her window and check if Karen's VW Rabbit was parked in their driveway. Amy peered out her window and confirmed to David that both Karen's car and his car were parked outside. David was desperate to know if the love of his life was okay, so he begged Amy to please go check on Karen, saying that he would remain on the phone until she came back. Remember, this is not a cell phone. It was a landline. So Amy put down the receiver and she walked across the street to David's house. The closest door to the road was their side door, which was under two giant oak trees and faced Upton. So Amy went up and she knocked, but she didn't get a response. So she made her way around the house to the front, which faced 27th Avenue South. And back then, many homes had jalousie doors, including this one. The door had jalousie window panes, and I'm showing a photo on screen, but they are these tiny horizontal window panes that function like Venetian blinds. They were really popular in the South because you could use this little knob and open and close the windows to let some fresh air inside on a hot summer day or night. Well, right when Amy headed up the walkway, she noticed that several of the thin glass panels were broken and some of the glass was lying on the path to the front door. This stood out, but she still walked up and she knocked. She also called out Karen's name, but she got no answer. So she walked to the back of the house and she noticed some curtains gently swaying from the breeze that appeared to be coming through an open bedroom window. As she got closer, she called out Karen's name again, but still nothing. When she got to the window, she realized it had a screen on it, but there was a cut in the screen and she could fit her hand through. So she carefully stuck her hand inside and moved the drapes just a little bit to peer in. First, she saw the bed. It appeared slept in. It wasn't made and there was no one in it. And then she scanned the room and finally her eyes landed on the floor outside of the bedroom. In the hallway, she could see the form of a woman's body on the floor just outside the door to the bedroom. And even though Amy could only see the body from the waist down, she could tell it was lying in a pool of blood. The sight was horrifying. She quickly backed away from the window and ran home, where David was still on the phone waiting for news. "David," she said, "something really bad has happened at your house." She was gasping. Her voice was filled with dread and urgency. She told him, "I need to hang up and call 911. David, stuck in Rhode Island, was unaware of exactly what Amy had found, and he was terrified for his girlfriend's well-being. As David's phone went silent, he just sat there. His heart was pounding. His mind was filled with worry. He had no idea what was going on back home. So a few minutes later, he called his house again, hoping that Karen would now answer and she could explain what was going on. But he was surprised when a woman's voice that he didn't recognize said, "Hello?" David told the woman that he was the owner of the home and he wanted to know where his girlfriend Karen Gregory was. Was she there? A woman, a police officer, said yes, she is. And David responded by asking, "Well, is she okay?" The officer merely said, "Sir, she's dead." He heard what the officer had just said, but he couldn't believe it was real. What happened? Let me take you back to after Amy called 911. That's when Officer Cheryl Falkenstein got on the scene. She tried all the doors, but they were locked. So she peered inside the same bedroom window that Amy looked into, and she saw the woman's body. She called out asking if she was okay, but she got no response. She called for paramedics, and while she waited, Cheryl took the screen off the window and she climbed inside the house. Once the officer made it to the hallway, she was immediately greeted by the gruesome sight of Karen's body sprawled across the floor. Her lifeless eyes were just staring up at the ceiling, her blood staining the carpet beneath her. The 22-year-old rookie cop ran to the front door and unlocked it to let in the paramedics. But it was clear that the woman was already dead, and she had been brutally murdered. It truly traumatized this officer. It was such a shocking sight. And all the while, David had no idea what was going on inside of his house. While homicide detectives were on their way to the scene, Officer Falkenstein scanned the bedroom. A box fan was still on inside. There was blood on the bed, as well as on a Hawaiian shirt and on the floor. And there were a pair of green shorts and tennis shoes that were still tied. And beside that was an umbrella, and right on top was a phone that was now ringing. She picked it up, and that is when she spoke to David, informing him that Karen was dead. Meanwhile, at a hospital where Karen's younger sister Kim was working as a nurse, she was just handed a piece of paper in the middle of her shift by one of her colleagues. All this piece of paper had on it was a phone number, and her colleague told her to call the number. Kim looked at the number and she was confused because she didn't recognize it. She's like, "What is this?" And her coworker said, "Just call the number." Kim could have never guessed the horrific news she was about to get. An officer on the other end asked Kim if she had a sister named Karen Gregory, and when she said yes, she informed her that Karen was dead. Kim was thinking like a medical professional, so she asked, "Well, what hospital is my sister in?" And that was when she was told Karen wasn't in a hospital. She was at 4727 27th Avenue South, and they were going to need Kim to come identify her body. Wow. I can't even imagine, but she and her husband made their way over to David's. And David was actually the one who informed Anita about Karen's murder. And when he did, She just screamed and screamed. She said, "That's not true. How can you say that?" But she realized that he was serious. And Anita then raced over to the scene with one of her friends, and they couldn't believe it. The yellow crime scene tape was already up around the house, and people were gathered out front. And when Officer Falkenstein met with them at the curb, she told Anita what she had witnessed inside. Imagine hearing that about your best friend. It was devastating. Anita was mixed with shock and disbelief and anger, watching all these strangers just gawking at the scene, hungry for more information, and she could not hold back. She asked one of the men standing around, "Don't you know what happened? You live here. Didn't you hear anything?" And surprisingly, the man, who was just walking his dog, said that he did hear a scream one night, late into the night. And Anita confronted him, saying, "And you called the police, right?" She was shocked when the man admitted he had not. She asked him, why not? And he explained that he only heard one scream, and he didn't know where it was coming from or what it was, and he didn't want to call because he didn't want them to think he was making a big deal out of nothing. But clearly, this wasn't nothing. But it was the beginning of a series of ear witnesses who decided not to call 911. You will learn that many neighbors heard Karen scream, yet none of them came to her rescue or even called for help. That's one layer of this case that made it stand out and made many people question what they would have done in this situation. So I'm going to ask you the same thing. Answer the question once you've heard more of the details. Detectives were on the scene, and they now noticed Karen's body had been stabbed over a dozen times. In addition, Karen had been struck with an object, causing severe injuries to her head. The investigators observed a significant amount of blood all throughout the room, all over the walls next to her body, on the furniture, and on the floors. Upon entering Karen's bedroom, investigators noticed blood smears on a wall and a bit of blood on the bed, indicating that this is where the attack probably began. The presence of more of a limited amount of blood on the bed and in this bedroom, along with the fact that the box fan was still on, suggested that Karen had been caught off guard while she was asleep, likely the victim of a surprise attack by her murderer. So this discovery further showed how terrifying Karen's murder really was. She was vulnerable and defenseless in her sleep. As investigators continued their search, they noticed that outside the bedroom and down the hall to the front door was a trail of blood. They determined that during the attack, Karen had managed to escape her murderer and make her way towards the jealousy door. They felt that either Karen had fallen through or been pushed into it, shattering the glass. But she wasn't able to get outside. She was pulled back inside, and the attack continued toward the hall of the bedroom, where she was ultimately killed. There was also a trail of bloody footprints that led away from Karen's body to the bathroom, where they found a partial bloody footprint inside. These footprints stood out because Karen's feet, even though they were barefoot like the prints, hers were clean. So this suggested that the murderer made these prints. There were also bloody footprints around Karen's body on the carpet and even a bloody handprint on her thigh. I've already said this, but blood was everywhere. And the placement of specific smears on the windowsill and the drapes where the officer had later entered suggested that the killer made his way out of the house through that same window. While at the crime scene, investigators conducted a thorough examination of Karen's body, and they noticed that she was wearing a black lingerie piece. But what was really odd was that it was placed over a baggy white t-shirt. Karen must have already been wearing the t-shirt, and this lingerie piece was unsnapped at the crotch area. Both of these items were pushed down, and they were bunched up at her waist, exposing her top half, and she wasn't wearing anything on the bottom. But this teddy, as it's known, this one-piece lingerie item, had seemingly been put on Karen's body by the killer at some point during the attack, which raised the likelihood that this was a sexually motivated crime. When it was time for the coroner, Dr. Joan Wood, to come to the scene and examine Karen's body before it was transported, there were a few concerns she had right away. First of all, Dr. Wood was very familiar with this location. She used to live on Upton, just a few houses down from where Karen was now lying lifeless on the ground. Dr. Wood knew that the Gulfport PD was a small police force, and this was a major homicide. She stepped out to call the chief of police to request that Lieutenant Frank Hansen be assisted by the state FDLE, or the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. She also suggested forensic specialists come in from Tampa. Even though, as in many cases, Hansen thought that his department could handle it on their own, the chief did end up taking Dr. Wood's advice, and soon the scene was crawling with a number of officers. They hadn't seen a crime like this in over about 20 years. Some had never witnessed anything so gruesome in their entire career. As the officers began canvassing the neighborhood, they noticed something very odd. What appeared to be a note of some kind, tucked under one of the windshield wipers of Karen's Volkswagen. The content of this note was a bit chilling, knowing what had occurred inside that house. It read, quote, "Karen and David, hello, stopped by at 7:15 or so, but saw no signs of life. I have a lot to do tonight, so I probably won't be back. But I have something you wanted. We'll be home not too late," end quote. And it was signed Peter, with a phone number included. Without knowing when this note was left, the investigators were very curious as to who this Peter person was. Meanwhile, Karen's body was being wheeled out in a body bag, and Anita was still watching this unfold. She was in disbelief. She peeked inside as the front door stood open and saw the blood all over. With bold curiosity, she asked an officer standing nearby, who's responsible for cleaning all of that up, knowing that David was on his way back in town that night. The officer let Anita know that they were done collecting evidence and that they did not offer cleaning services after a crime. It would be left up to the person who owned the home. Anita was in shock when she realized that David would be walking into a place where his soulmate had lay dying. She couldn't bear to imagine that heartache, so she took it upon herself to clean the home where her best friend had been killed. I couldn't believe they were even done collecting evidence, but this was the 80s. Nowadays, they could take days, even weeks or longer to analyze a crime scene. Anita and her friend Michaela went to get cleaning supplies and returned to David's to undertake the gut-wrenching task of cleaning up all of Karen's blood. And as they started this job, Anita was disturbed by the sight that greeted them. The blood was still fresh. It covered the walls, the furniture, the floors, and it was just a reminder of the violent act that happened just hours before. I don't think I could do it. But at this point, investigators are actually going to get their first lead, the note on Karen's car. They wondered if it had been quiet when this Peter person left the note. Could Karen have already been dead? And if so, how could this man have missed the broken glass on the walkway? And the part about no signs of life? That seemed really odd. Armed with at least Peter's first name and a phone number, they began going door to door in the neighborhood. Maybe he was a neighbor, or maybe someone knew who Peter was. They were also interested in getting any information about something suspicious that anyone close by had seen or heard. And we already know that one man admitted to hearing a scream late one night. But which night? And why hadn't the so-called Crime Watch group investigated? I mean, isn't that the point of having a crime watch to begin with? But on the other hand, officers knew that these kind of wannabe Crime Stoppers groups usually don't do much, and the signs like the ones they put up don't actually deter criminals at all. But they still wondered what the neighbors had noticed. They were about to get even more leads. They really needed to get a timeline as to when Karen was killed. That week leading up to Karen's murder was warm, and many residents had their windows open at night. One neighbor, Arthur Cooper, who lived right behind David's home, told the detectives that he had been reading a book in bed, unable to sleep on Tuesday night after he drank way too many espressos. He clearly recalled sitting in bed listening to the radio and reading when he heard what he described as a short, high-pitched, agonizing scream. Instinctually, since it was so late, he gazed over at the clock, thinking like, what time is it that I'm hearing something like that? It was eerie, and it was 1:15 a.m., but he added that his clock could have been a couple minutes fast or slow. He wasn't sure. But the scream really shook him, so much so he got out of bed, turned off his bedroom light so he could see better out the window, and even turned off his radio. That way he could listen for more screams. But when he peered outside, he didn't see anything, and he didn't hear any more sounds. It was lightly raining, and he said he sat there for about 15 minutes or so just waiting if he could hear anything else. But he didn't, so eventually he went to sleep. But now investigators had a rough timeline. the early morning hours of Wednesday, May 23rd, but they needed more information. However, it does add up with what we know, because that was the night that Karen left Naverne saying that she was tired and wanted to go right to bed. Investigators spoke to another neighbor named Martha Burkowski, who lived right across the street from David's house. She said that she also remembered hearing a scream and thinking, wow, that woman must not be a smoker because she's got quite a set of lungs on her. Really? She wasn't thinking of calling the police, but instead she's admiring this woman's vocals? But Martha explained that it was probably around 1 o'clock in the morning because she recalled having a really tough time falling asleep that night and she was gazing over at the clock. She also heard a door slam, and to her it sounded like a car door, but she couldn't be sure. Again, this was the second neighbor reporting that this happened around 1 a.m. on Wednesday. But what Martha does remember is something odd. She said something happened later that afternoon, well after the scream. She was driving home from work, and she saw the door to David's front patio area that you have to go through before you get to the front door wide open. But the thing is, the door had been opened like this before when the wind had blown through the windows, so she really didn't think it was that big of a deal. However, when it got dark, she remembered seeing a man that she had never seen before park his van in David's driveway. The man then walked around to the front of the house and up to where the open door was. He walked through it onto the patio and knocked on the front door. To be clear, the jalousie doors led to what's called a Florida room. It's an enclosed patio, and there's another door inside that leads to the house. On this patio area, the investigators had found blood droplets, and they led from the front door to the jalousie door. So they knew that Karen had come out onto the patio trying to escape before being slammed into those windows. Some of her hair had been left behind. They imagined that her scream probably came from her as she was inside the more open portion of the home in this enclosed patio with the windows open, and that's why neighbors could hear it more clearly. Martha said she saw the man leave the patio and then walk around and look up and down the street, and she thought that was weird. Then the man, who she said was tall and skinny and had curly hair and a beard, went to his van and he sat inside for a while before getting out and putting something on Karen's vehicle. It was the note. So now there's a timeline for the note. Wednesday evening, about 15 hours or so after the scream was heard. A third neighbor, Glenda Harness, who lived right across the street from David with her boyfriend George Lewis, said she distinctly remembers hearing that scream in the middle of the night. The house was in close proximity to David's. They were actually on the southeast corner and David was on the northwest corner, so they were diagonally right across from one another. Glenda explained that the scream actually woke her up. She was pregnant and having a hard time getting to bed, but she recalled finally settling in, and then the scream pierced through the quietness of the neighborhood. She got up, she looked out one of her windows, and she actually saw one of the couples she knew from across the street right next to David's house standing outside of their front door, and then the wife kind of motioned for them to go back in. The investigators asked if Glenda's boyfriend had been home that night and if he saw anything, and she told them, yeah, he was home, and he was a firefighter, and he went to go out and check if anything was wrong in the neighborhood that night. Glenda explained that they were part of the neighborhood watch, and when she heard the scream and saw the neighbors peering outside of their door, she ran to the kitchen window that faces their detached garage, where her boyfriend was working on his motorcycle. She wanted to alert him, but she couldn't see in the dark, so she ran and got a flashlight, not to venture outside. Instead, she was planning on using it as a weapon in case someone tried to come inside her home. She waited for George to come back inside, and when he did, he explained that he also heard the scream, and he went up and down the streets to see if he could find out where it had come from. But he didn't see anything unusual, and after talking about it for a bit, they went to bed. Investigators made note to speak with George. Now, Detective Tosi took up the task of speaking with firefighter Lewis, who worked for the nearby city of St. Petersburg, and he also volunteered at the local Gulfport fire station, which was right next to the police station, so they knew each other very well. And Tosi considered George a reliable friend, so they were banking on George, whose girlfriend said that he actually went to check on where the scream was coming from, to offer up some very valuable information. After George was done working that day, he came right over to the police department to meet with Detective Tosi. George did have information about the night. He worked odd shifts at the fire station, so he was usually awake late into the night, and that night was no different. He said he had worked that day, but later he was out in his detached garage working on his motorcycle when he heard a loud scream. But then he said it stopped. so he wasn't sure which direction it was coming from. But he stopped working and he left to go check the area. But he didn't see anything or hear any more screams, so he went back home. However, George mentioned things that he had seen. First, he said that not too long before this, he recalled some commotion over at David's house involving, in his words, 2 black guys. He wasn't sure what happened, but he saw an ambulance outside. And this was a few weeks ago. He also said that after he heard the scream, he checked around and he saw a man riding past on a bike, but he couldn't really see characteristics in the dark. And then later that evening, he had seen a man arrive at David's house in a van. This man walked around and left a note on Karen's car. According to George, this person was strange, and the detectives knew the person being referred to was most likely the same man Martha had reported seeing, and the note was signed with the name Peter. Altogether, 12 people heard Karen scream on the night of her murder, but none of them chose to call 911. Karen's desperate cry for help remained unanswered, highlighting a very disturbing failure on the part of the neighborhood watch. The primary objective of this neighborhood watch is to ensure the security and well-being of the community that live there. Unfortunately, in this instance, not a single person stepped forward to assist Karen in her greatest time of need. And there were many excuses why no one took action. There were things from, I thought it was cats fighting, to I thought someone was just having a nightmare and they screamed. But now after the fact, when neighbors understand that a murder occurred in their neighborhood, now they're saying, the scream was blood-curdling. It was agonizing. It was a scream that I'll never forget because it sounded like someone was being killed. Well, they were. But all of this was so contradictory, and maybe they could have wanted attention of some kind after the fact when they were being interviewed for the newspaper or TV or things like that. I mean, that's actually not that uncommon. People get really invested and interested in things that happen nearby, but they're also worried because this happened in their own neighborhood and there was a killer on the loose. I personally wondered if there was a sense of guilt that they felt for not doing anything in a moment that someone actually needed help. But a lot of times, even statistics show that when there is something happening like this, people won't come forward because they don't want to put themselves in danger. And on one hand, I really can't blame them. But on the other hand, all you have to do if you see something is say something to the police. That's all you have to do. You can do it anonymously. You don't have to put yourself in danger. You don't have to go investigate, but at least call 911. Even if you do think that you're going to look stupid if it turns out to just be an animal crying. After further investigation, the detectives discovered that the 2 men and the ambulance situation over at David's a month prior were actually his lawn care maintenance workers, and one of them just happened to need medical attention while on the job. He collapsed, and it was later found out that he had a seizure while working. But what was more interesting was that this person, Lawrence Saunders, was a Vietnam veteran that met David from the counseling center where he worked. David had hired him to do some odd jobs here and there and work on his lawn. He had actually been there on Tuesday morning. This is a person who had been inside the residence before, and they knew the layout, including where Karen would be asleep. So this was a lead. They had another lead as well. They found out that the Peter who wrote the note was Peter Kumble, a local man and acquaintance of Karen and David's, who had a weekly radio show. And they were uncovering all of this the same day that Karen's body had been discovered, on Thursday, May 24th, so they were working fast. Detectives quickly made their way over to Lawrence Saunders' house, the lawn worker, and he was there with his wife. And they brought him down to the police station, where they were there for a few hours interviewing this man, asking him questions about what he knew about Karen and David. He said he didn't know that David was out of town, but he did see Karen that Tuesday morning, and she told him she left him a check in the mailbox, which was something that she would usually do when David wasn't around, to hand the check to him himself. He just kept repeating that he couldn't believe Karen had been murdered, that they were such good people, and he was shocked, and that's all he knew. He was completely cooperative, and his wife confirmed his alibi, that he had been home Tuesday night into the early morning hours of Wednesday. So for now, he was ruled out, because they wanted to move on to this Peter person, who they found out was actually a closer friend with Karen's best friend and former roommate, Anita. So they formulated a plan to get Peter, who they considered a person of interest, to be checked out. The detectives informed Anita that 2 people were required for the identification process and they still needed someone to ID Karen's body. However, in reality, that wasn't the case at all. The detectives had different motives. They hoped that Anita would bring Peter with her to the morgue, and the plan actually worked. What are the chances? Anita would bring Peter along, but when they arrived, Detective Tosi questioned Peter at the morgue. He asked about Peter's relationship with Karen. Peter stated that he first met Karen during her time working at the Garden restaurant in St. Petersburg. They formed a friendship, and that's all it was, a friendship. During the questioning, Detective Tosi noticed there was an injury on Peter's hand, and this wound appeared to be consistent with someone who had fought back in an attack. The detectives had a reason to believe that Karen's murderer would have sustained injuries, considering how fiercely she had fought to escape. Peter could sense that the detectives were staring at his injured hand, so he moved it out of their sight. And then he informed the detectives that he had recently obtained a new puppy who had caused the wound. Interesting, but not uncommon. When the detective inquired about Peter's presence at Karen's residence on the evening of May 23rd and the note that he left for her, Peter explained that he thought Karen had invited him to dinner that evening. However, he admitted that he might have mixed up the dates, considering he now knew that David would be out of town. But was Peter telling the truth? Because Karen didn't seem like the type to invite another man over, according to those who knew her, especially not to her boyfriend's house while he was out of town. Tosi also wanted to know what was the thing in the note that he mentioned Karen wanting. Peter said that he and Karen shared a common interest in reggae music, and he had brought back a cassette tape that she had let him borrow. That's all. He was just returning a tape. The detectives found it kind of strange that Peter hadn't noticed any glass on the front pathway or on the patio during this visit. According to Peter, the door was closed and it was secured when he arrived at the house. It was also dark, so maybe he missed the glass on the ground. Peter also let the detectives know that he already planned a vacation to Boston and he would be leaving the next day. Anita had been awaiting news of the exact date that Karen's funeral would be held, which was already being planned back home in Albany, New York. So Anita was going to hitch a ride with Peter when he left. But they let the detectives know that they would be back in town afterward, and Peter assured the detectives that he would reach out to them as soon as he came back in town. After the interview, Peter provided detectives with his fingerprints and hair samples. Despite his denial of having any romantic feelings for Karen, the detectives had suspicions regarding his truthfulness. They formulated a theory that suggested that Peter had visited Karen that night to discuss a potential relationship, maybe knowing that she had just moved in with David, and maybe he was trying to change her mind before she got even more serious. But when he was rejected, he attacked and killed her in a fit of rage. I think this is a good time to talk about what the medical examiner found during the autopsy, so that you will have a clear perspective on what kind of attack I'm talking about. Dr. Wood, the medical examiner's findings, provided some insight into the events leading up to Karen's death. It was determined that her time of death was in the early morning of Wednesday, May 23rd, after she returned home from Nervern's house. Her injuries were all similar in appearance. They were consistent with being inflicted by a buck knife. Despite a thorough search, the investigators were never able to locate a weapon at the crime scene. There was at least 13 stab wounds to Karen's neck alone. One of them had nicked her spine. There were 2 more that had cut across her larynx, so she would not have been able to make a sound following those injuries. The blunt trauma to her head suggested that she was bludgeoned or was slammed into something repeatedly. Karen's body revealed another chilling detail. She had sustained several defensive injuries to her hands, including a broken finger. These wounds indicated that she had fought back against her killer. The medical examiner also concluded the combination of the knife wounds and the head trauma had ultimately led to Karen bleeding to death. An SA kit was also used and seminal fluid was found. The forensic examination conducted on the male DNA cells revealed that they were deposited approximately 12 hours before Karen's body was found. And I was thinking they must have been studied under a microscope, and maybe they could determine how old the sample was by the way the sperm appeared. I wasn't sure because DNA technology at the time did not offer the same level of sophistication as it does today. And there wasn't even enough DNA in the sample to compare to a potential suspect. And as a result, law enforcement was unable to identify any potential matches, even if they were able to get a sample from a person of interest. However, today, you don't need that much. So they would have known right away who matched that person's DNA, especially if it was in CODIS, but none of that existed. Additional evidence suggested a forced sexual encounter related to the crime, not a consensual event, because Karen was known for being conscientious about her birth control, always ensuring her diaphragm was present during intercourse. These are not as common these days, but they're a dome-shaped cup, kind of like a period cup, that's inserted before intercourse and used as a barrier method of birth control to prevent pregnancy. The lack of her diaphragm indicated that the sexual encounter was against her will. This strengthened their theory that the killer's intent was forcing her into intercourse. What was also disgusting was that the killer tried to slit her neck, but was not able to. Who knows if he stopped because he was interrupted or if the knife just wasn't sharp enough. That's very sad and very brutal, almost personal in nature, because after this report came in, Detective Tossi was perplexed. It was clear by the state of Karen's body that a struggle took place, but there was no evidence of a struggle occurring in the house. And what I mean by that, it was as though the killer somehow knew the layout of this home and was somehow able to avoid knocking anything over. Despite stacks of records and tall lamps, nothing was on the floor knocked down. Everything remained in its proper place. And this really bothered Detective Tossi. All the light switches were turned off when first responders came to the scene. And if the murder occurred sometime around 1 a.m., it would have been really dark in that house. The fight seemed so intense. So how did nothing get knocked over? The detective decided to go back over there in the darkness of the night and test things out to find out what he could see and what it would have looked like when Karen was murdered. He and Detective Reed went over there and walked the scene in the dark. There was no way the killer could have seen what he was doing that night and hadn't knocked things over. They wouldn't have risked turning on a light in such a tight-knit neighborhood where someone could have seen them. After careful consideration, the detectives determined that because a neighbor, Martha, had seen the door wide open later that afternoon, but it was closed when Peter came there in the evening, the killer had come back to the scene after the murder to somewhat clean up or to cover up any evidence. So he must have picked things up and put them back in their places. And that is so risky. It added just another layer to this crime. And when they went back over all the evidence that was collected, something had been found on the scene that stood out. It was a newspaper. Now, it wasn't just any newspaper. It was called the Village Voice. It was a newspaper from Providence, Rhode Island. This was inside the house where Karen's body was found, just feet away. This discovery seemed really strange to detectives for a couple of reasons. First, they were located in Florida. And secondly, Karen's boyfriend David had claimed that he was in Rhode Island at the time of Karen's murder. Despite David's assertion that he was out of state when Karen was killed, the detectives were now skeptical. They wondered if somehow he could have had enough time to fly to Rhode Island, return to Florida, commit the murder, and then head back to Providence in time for his presentation. Very interesting, especially since it was David who asked his neighbor to go to his home, and then she stumbled upon the scene. Karen's family and loved ones had to cope with the devastating news of her death. The detectives turned to her brother Roy for more information about Karen's relationship with David. And despite loving David and believing that he would never harm his sister, Roy did feel obligated to tell the investigators some very important details. According to Roy, the couple had a brief breakup shortly before Karen decided to move into David's home. However, he said the breakup was far from anything significant, and the couple quickly reconciled, or at least he believed that anyway. But it was more interesting information for detectives to go on. When Karen was murdered, her mother, Sophia, planned a beautiful memorial mass to be celebrated for Karen at the Sacred Heart Church in Albany, where Karen had made her sacraments as a child. But Karen's friends couldn't help but smirk, because she once jokingly told them that she would never, ever enter that church again, because she left her Catholic faith behind a long time ago. But before her death, Karen and her mom had been growing closer. Although Sophia still struggled to understand Karen's choices, Despite their differences, Sophia eventually accepted her daughter for who she was, and she even considered moving to Florida to be closer to Karen and her other daughter, Kim. At this point, detectives are delving deeper into the investigation into David as a potential suspect, and they noticed a gap in his whereabouts when he was in Rhode Island, and he did not resurface until the following day. So, Detective Tosi became suspicious and wondered if this mysterious absence had anything to do with Karen's murder because he thought it did. Maybe David having her move in with him was merely a ploy to get her away from her roommate and into a more secluded spot where he could confront her all alone. Detective Tosi was determined to find out if David had sufficient time to make that round trip from Rhode Island to Florida and back for his presentation. So he embarked on a journey up north. He took a flight to Boston, rented a car to drive to Providence, as David would have most likely done, and then headed back to Florida before returning to Rhode Island. And by following David's hypothetical route, Detective Tosi was able to determine David had ample time to commit the murder and go back to his conference. Wow. So upon returning from Karen's funeral in Albany, David was immediately questioned by the detectives. He professed his love for Karen, and he expressed his deep sadness about what happened to her. He claimed that Karen was the one that he had been looking for his entire life, and he would never want to lose her or do anything to hurt her. The detectives stayed skeptical of his claims, though, and they pressed him for even more information. They wanted to uncover any inconsistencies or discrepancies in any of his statements. However, David maintained his innocence and his story. When the detectives confronted David with the claim that the couple had some problems in the past, he brushed them aside. He said, "Yes, I will admit, like many couples, we had our issues, but we were good friends in addition to lovers." And according to David, the last day he saw Karen was when she dropped him off at the airport. If that was true, how could he explain the Village Voice newspaper from Rhode Island being in the house before he came back home, but after Karen was murdered? Plus, according to Detective Tosi, David inserted himself into this investigation because he kept calling and asking for more and more updates on the case. And it's true. Family and friends were known to do this, but Detective Tosi also knew that sometimes murderers would do things like this to try to make sense of where the detectives were in their investigation of the case. So David was asked to take a polygraph, and he agreed. The test showed no deception. David was eager to clear his name. Although he was hurt because they were considering him a suspect in the murder of the love of his life, he knew that the police were just doing their jobs. David told the detectives that the newspaper found in his Florida home was actually purchased at a newsstand in Pinellas County before he went to Providence. That was because he was a planner. He wanted to gather information about what was happening in the state he was about to go to and check the weather so he knew what type of clothing to bring. This was before the internet, so this would be one of the ways you would normally check. But you could also just call the hotel you were going to be staying at, which seemed way easier for David to do. But detectives spoke to the owner of the newsstand, and he confirmed that David had indeed purchased the Rhode Island newspaper several days before Karen was murdered. But then there was something else that didn't make sense. When they checked the weather section, the detectives noticed it said there would be rain in Rhode Island. So why then was David's black umbrella found on the floor of the bedroom close to where the bloodstain was located on the bed? He insisted that he just forgot it. And it was also raining in Florida too. So Karen most likely used it that night when she walked inside from her car. She just brought it into the bedroom, exhausted from the day, and it was confirmed by Naverne that the baggy white t-shirt Karen was found in and the green shorts by her bed were the ones she was wearing when she was at her place that night. Karen most likely walked in, put the umbrella down in the bedroom, took off her shorts, and crawled into bed in her t-shirt. This information eliminated David as a suspect for the time being, and with David cleared, Detective Tosi decided to ask him who he thought committed the crime. And David expressed doubts about Peter. He said he felt that Peter had romantic feelings for Karen, but at that point, there wasn't anything linking him to the scene. So they asked David to go back in with them, and they would take an inventory of his entire house, and he would let them know if anything stood out or if anything was missing, because there was still a chance that this could have been a robbery gone wrong. As David and the detectives began searching through his home, David noticed that all the valuable items that would typically be stolen during a robbery were still there. However, one item was missing, and it stood out as strange. In March, 2 months before Karen was killed, Karen had purchased a white lace teddy for herself, and of course, she brought it home and showed it to David. However, as David continued his search, he realized that piece of lingerie was missing. Now remember, a similar black piece of lingerie was found on Karen's body, so this intrigued Detective Tosi. Karen was found lying on her side in a fetal position, but she had been moved back and forth, and this was evident by the bloody handprints on her legs. The detective wondered if the killer had come back later and put the black teddy on her body, or if he had done it when she was unable to move, or if he had even forced her at knife point to put it on before he took advantage of her. Had he taken the white teddy as a trophy? It was all very odd. And after the tragic murder of his girlfriend, David found himself drowning in unbearable pain. It was so intense that he had lost the will to live. He even contemplated taking his own life more times than he could ever count. Life just no longer held any joy or purpose for him, and he found himself merely going through the motions. There was just this hole where happiness and joy used to fill. There was so much anger inside of him, fueled by the brutal manner in which Karen had been murdered. David couldn't help think about finding the man who did this and seeking revenge by doing violent things to him. The house that was once David's sanctuary no longer held any significance for him. This was a place he was going to share his life with Karen, and now it was just a reminder of her loss. He returned occasionally to just do some basic chores around the yard, but other than that, he never truly lived there ever again. And in the aftermath, David moved into a friend's apartment and slept on the couch. His house was nothing more of a collection of personal belongings, and he no longer felt it was truly his home. And eventually, he sold his residence and moved into an apartment in St. Petersburg, just waiting to find out who was responsible for ruining his life and taking Karen's. Detective Tosi received the results from the forensic evidence found at the crime scene, and one of the pieces of evidence examined was a handprint on Karen's thigh. However, the print was deemed unusable because it soaked into the pores of her skin, and then another print found on the windowsill came back as a match to the responding officer who climbed through the window. Examination of the carpet floor revealed these bare footprints. However, the footprints were heavily soaked in blood, and they were virtually indistinguishable from the carpet's fiber. So as a result, they couldn't be used to match to a suspect. And unfortunately, the bloody footprint, that partial print from the bathroom tile, was also determined not to be usable because it had soaked into the tile, making it difficult to get any usable details from it. Because of these challenges, Peter Kumble remained the prime suspect in Karen's murder. First of all, David told investigators that he would have known if Karen was having dinner with anyone, especially a guy, especially Peter, because she would have shared that with him. And Anita had talked about the fact that Peter had asked her to relay messages to Karen a number of times, even though he knew she was dating David. He would also brag about how much they had in common, that they were both from New England, and how he was trying to make plans to go on a bike ride with her. This just kept standing out to Detective Tosi. So he questioned Peter's coworkers at the firm where he worked as a draftsman. They asked why Peter left town after Karen's murder, but his coworkers claimed that Peter's trip was not all of a sudden. It was planned for weeks. Then they questioned Peter's friends about his behavior, and they described him as a gentle and kind man. They claimed they had never, ever seen him be violent or display any signs of aggression. But still, the detectives found it strange that Peter failed to recognize the presence of blood inside the patio or the shattered glass outside David's home during that visit. Upon returning from his trip, Peter voluntarily returned to the police station for another interview. And this time, Peter had his attorney present because he knew he was being looked at as a suspect. Despite his concerns, Peter was determined to help in any way possible with the case. On the night of Karen's murder, Peter claimed he was at home with his roommate all night, and his roommate verified this alibi. Although he was not cleared as a suspect, Peter was temporarily moved to the back burner because the detectives had to pursue other leads. There just wasn't anything concrete to pin on him. So back to the scene and the evidence that was already collected. Investigators focused in on a schematic drawing of a clock with a bloodstain on it. It prompted them to question if the murderer had brought this with them and somehow left it there. It was definitely out of place, and upon further investigation, the detectives determined that the schematics were crafted by a guy named Stephen Fischler. He worked with Karen at her new job with Datacom Associates. Now that was interesting. So as part of their investigation, they began looking into Stephen. The detectives uncovered information from female colleagues regarding his behavior. These women expressed being really uncomfortable around Stephen. They said that he made them feel uneasy, had shown them sexually explicit images, and it frightened them. Additionally, a friend of Karen's came forward and claimed that Stephen Fischler had made Karen uncomfortable on multiple occasions. He made unwanted advances, and once he even gave her a provocative novel that he was writing. When the detectives interviewed Stephen, he claimed to have very limited knowledge about Karen since she had only been hired weeks before her death. Stephen said they were both working on a project for a company, and it consisted of things on an instrument panel, and Karen must have taken one of her schematics home with her in the form of that drawing. He'd never been inside her house, and he said the reason he spoke to her about his book and gave her a copy was because she agreed to illustrate it for him. That's all. He even agreed to take a polygraph test. He was asked a number of questions, and they got increasingly pointed. And as this interview went on, everyone could tell that Stephen was becoming more uncomfortable. And then all of a sudden, he just shouted, "Okay, I did it." They couldn't believe it. Was he actually admitting he killed Karen? Well, not exactly. Not at all, actually. The detectives determined that Stephen only said this because he was extremely frustrated. Stephen quickly retracted this confession, and after the polygraph was complete, it was determined that there was no deception indicated. However, the detectives could not completely dismiss him as a suspect, but again, there just wasn't enough to tie him to the crime, which is very frustrating. The detectives collected fingerprints and hair samples from every man they spoke to as a potential suspect. Despite having various suspects in Karen's murder, the detectives were not able to narrow it down to just one person as their primary culprit. So Detective Tosi approached FDLE. He wanted some assistance creating a life-size photo from the negative of the bloody footprint from the bathroom floor. The detective was hoping that if he blew up the image, they would be able to see the ridges, and maybe this could help identify an assailant. However, the detective was informed that this was not feasible, that if they did this, it would just be an image with a bunch of splotches of blood. And then there was that Hawaiian shirt. I don't know if you remember me mentioning that they found this random bloody Hawaiian shirt in the bedroom, and they didn't know who it belonged to. David said it wasn't his, and that he had never seen Karen wear it. They showed the shirt to a number of Karen's friends, even went so far as to show the shirt to one of her ex-boyfriends all the way back in New Hampshire. But none of them said that this was something that Karen would wear. It just wasn't her style. But it was a woman's shirt. It was too small to fit an average man. And in their perspective, it looked more like a woman's style Hawaiian shirt. This just kept bothering Detective Tosi because at this point, he started to go back through all the evidence and realized that even though these specialists came in and they were supposed to be doing a better job than his department, he felt like this whole investigation was rushed. Because as soon as they found that fingerprint on the windowsill that ended up not even belonging to an assailant, but instead an officer, it was kind of like case closed. And they got kind of lazy and slacked off. And they didn't really give it their all like they should have. And now he was thinking, why didn't they do things like vacuum so that maybe they could get hairs? Why did they let Anita clean the entire crime scene so soon after the crime had occurred? So all he had at this point were pictures of the crime scene. And this Hawaiian shirt just kept sticking with him. But there just wasn't that much to go on, so it was just another clue he was trying to piece together. As the investigation progressed, Karen's friend and former roommate Anita feared returning to Florida. She actually decided to travel across the country after visiting New York because she was terrified that the killer would come after her next. Karen's murder had a profound impact on her family and their way of life. It brought about a newfound sense of fear and paranoia. Her brother Mark, for instance, he admonished his wife for honking the horn at an aggressive driver on the highway because he thought the driver could be armed and then would retaliate. Roy, Karen's other brother, also experienced a change in his behavior. He used to go to the movies and then walk home alone at night. But after his sister was murdered, he became very cautious and fearful. He didn't want to go out after dark, and he even considered taking his own life because the loss of his sister had left him devastated. He wanted a way to be reunited with her. He even considered driving his car off of a bridge in Tampa, hoping that his death would connect him with Karen. But ultimately, he didn't do this because he realized how much pain it would cause his family. They had already been through so much. But anytime Karen's name was mentioned, her mom, Sophia, would break down in tears. She found herself in a constant state of depression, and it was difficult for her to cope with Karen's loss. Kim, Karen's sister, also lived in a constant fear for her safety. She thought that she might be the killer's next victim, so she carried mace with her in her purse. The tragedy of her sister's murder had left her feeling vulnerable and concerned about her well-being. All she could think about were Karen's words in which she expressed her desire not to die a violent death like the victim in the movie Looking for Mr. Goodbar. And that's exactly what happened, and it was hard for her to shake. There was also the possibility of a serial killer stalking the streets of Gulfport, and that terrified the residents. And as a result, many people bought guns and kept them by their bedside tables and installed double locks on their doors and even put lights outside their house for added security. Months went by without any progress in Karen's murder case. Her family continued to wait and try their best to deal with their loss, struggling to come to terms with the devastating impact it had on their lives. And Detective Tosi dedicated all of his time and energy to solving this case. However, on December 15, 1984, he decided to take a much-needed break from his professional duties to celebrate a special occasion. That day, he was designated as a notary at the wedding of his longtime friend and colleague and David's across-the-street neighbor, 22-year-old George Lewis, and his new wife, Glenda Harness. It was being held at the firehouse that George worked at in St. Petersburg, and I guess that's fitting for a firefighter. Could also be looked at as kind of cheesy. There was one point where him and his bride got into the fire ladder basket and they were lifted off the ground, and then they said their vows and they kissed up there. But after this wedding, Detective Tosi was back on the case. 5 months had passed since Karen's murder, and their next lead was about to come in. There was a going-away party held at Gulfport City Hall for one of the city managers that was relocating to a different city, and one of the officers who worked on Karen's case was at this event. The officer was approached by a woman named Mary Messervy, and she was a bus driver in town. She just kind of mentioned how shocking the murder was and how she remembered hearing that scream that night. Well, eventually, this information was relayed to Detective Hansen, and since they really had no leads going on, they were planning to speak with Marie to see if she could provide any additional information. But before even talking to her, Hansen was shocked when he looked up her address. Sure, she lived in the same neighborhood, but she lived on 46th Street South. And if you're watching, I've mapped out the approximate location. She lived 1 block south and 3 blocks east of David's home, not as close as any of the other neighbors, and it's actually quite a distance away. And yet she was saying that she heard Karen scream. So now detectives wondered if she was making this up. Remember how I told you some people just want to insert themselves into the story? Hansen called Tosi immediately because when they first canvassed the area, they only talked to the neighbors that were in the vicinity, like only a few houses away, because they didn't think to go even more than maybe a block or two away from the house. Normally, when you hear someone scream, you figure that a few people around the front and maybe the back of where Karen lived had heard it, but you wouldn't think that it carried that far. So now they were back at the office, sifting through all the evidence again, every statement, anything that stood out. And one of those things that stood out was the signed statement from George Lewis, the firefighter, who said he was actually outside, presumably with the garage door open. So they wondered if Karen was struggling to escape and she made it out the front door and onto the patio before crashing into the glass or being pushed into the glass. And remember, the detectives believed the scream happened around that time. They thought maybe they should speak to George again to see if he could give them any more information. Maybe he missed something the first time, or maybe he remembered something, anything that stood out about that night. He would have been the closest in proximity as far as they knew at the time. The thing is, it was kind of a bit of a conflict of interest because George was friends with Tosi. So collectively, the detectives decided that Hansen could do a more professional interview with George. That way, it was more than just a casual conversation between two friends. When you're put in a more professional setting, like a police station, where you're being interviewed just like everybody else, they have tactics and things to bring out more information. So they decide Hansen is going to be tasked with re-interviewing George. Hansen reached out, but you have to remember this was during the holidays, there was Christmas, and then New Year was rolling around, plus George and his wife were having a baby. So all of these new things were happening, and I, for one, know exactly what that's like because I'm going through all of that right now. So they didn't get to speak to George until after the New Year. So now it's 1985, mid-January. And it just so happens that there was a house fire in Gulfport, and all the officers go there. And of course, George is there helping put out the fire. So they thought that this would be a great opportunity to reconnect with him. Hansen said, "Hey, George." And there he was, all sweaty and dirty and tired. George with his thick red hair, firefighter uniform on. He just kind of looked up from the fire hose and said, "Hello," back to Hansen. Then he apologized for being so busy and not reconnecting with him sooner. He said the next few days he had to lay down some carpet for his wife, but he would come in afterwards to speak with him regarding any new information he could have thought of. But Hansen was on high alert at this point. Everything and anything is sticking out to him. Any little detail he's writing down. And initially when he called out to George, he was kind of leaning over his fire hose, and you remember George kind of being caught off guard. There was just this look on his face like he wasn't expecting Hansen to be right behind him. It could have been suspicious, I guess, but he could also have been in the middle of maybe putting out a fire, and he was not thinking that someone's going to be behind him. George finally did come back to the station a week later, and he was able to provide them with the same information he had from the beginning. And he had told this many times over again, except there was a discrepancy. Hansen noticed that in the first written statement, George said that he heard the scream, then walked up and down the street, went back to the garage where he was working, saw a guy riding his bike, but couldn't make out any characteristics in the dark. But this time, he said, he went to check the street, then turned off his garage light, closed his garage door, and went back in the house. So he left out the guy on the bike. And also added he never heard any glass shattering because they asked him specifically since he was so close by. The detectives knew that they would not be doing their due diligence if they didn't treat George like any other witness. They'd even had Peter and other people like the lawn maintenance worker do a more intense interview with a polygraph. The fact that they all knew George made this very difficult. So they decided it was best to bring in a polygrapher who wasn't acquainted with George to carry out a polygraph test. George, like every other person who sat for a polygraph, wasn't excited about it, but he knew it was necessary to clear his name. Detective Tosi waited outside the room while the test was happening, and the polygrapher asked George what he asked everyone. Things like, did you kill Karen? Did you stab Karen? Were you there when Karen was stabbed? Do you know who killed Karen? Were you there when she was murdered? And during this phase, the polygrapher detected deception in George's answers, and he pressed him further, saying, "I know you're lying." And that is when George broke down and cried. Detective Tosi was informed and came back in to speak with George, who was overcome with emotion. He insisted to Detective Tosi he was not guilty of harming Karen. He'd never even met her before. He hadn't even seen her in the neighborhood before she was murdered. But he lied about something, and he was holding on to a lot of guilt about it. He had withheld important information about what happened that night, what he saw that night. He never came forward about it. Initially, it's true, he didn't see anyone, so he went back to his garage to gather some items that he needed to throw away, and when he put the lid back on his garbage can at the end of his driveway, something caught his eye. There was a man walking right underneath the oak trees outside of David's house. But instead of running up to him or yelling, George, being overworked and exhausted with a pregnant wife at home, decided it wasn't worth getting involved, just in case it was someone up to no good. He knew that it was part of his job, not only as a night watchman, but as a firefighter, to help others. But he put himself and his own family first. And now he feels awful. He didn't want to admit it, but he got scared when the guy stopped and stared right at him. It was understandable, especially after George described the man to the detectives. He said he was a large, white, middle-aged man, about 6'4". He had reddish hair down to his collar and a trimmed light red beard, stocky shoulders, muscular arms, and wearing a loose-fitting green shirt that almost looked like hospital scrubs with short sleeves and dark dress pants. However, when they asked George if the man was wearing shoes, because remember, the bare footprints inside the crime scene, Unfortunately, George said he could not recall. He didn't know if he was wearing shoes, what kind of shoes they were, or if he had none at all. They asked what happened next, and George said he turned around, walked back to his house, and the last thing he remembered was seeing the man walking towards David's driveway. But he didn't hear or see a car, and he doesn't know where the guy went. He never told his now wife at the time because she was pregnant, and he didn't want to stress her out or worry or scare her. He said he was also genuinely worried that if he said anything to the police, this guy would come back and target them. So he remained quiet, which is why he kept avoiding coming in for an interview. But now that they had this new lead, it was really important to get a composite sketch made and fast. That was their next move. After it was completed, it was distributed among residents in Gulfport and Karen's friends and family, but no one recognized the person depicted. Meanwhile, after the huge new development in the case, Detective Tosi, of course, informed his wife. I'm sure that was quite a story about what happened at work that day, that George came forward with this new evidence. Since Detective Tosi was close to George, their wives, Glenda and Debbie, also hung out together. And after Tosi spoke to his wife, Debbie provided information about what she remembered George's then-girlfriend Glenda relaying to her, which seemed to match up. She said she remembered Glenda saying she heard the scream. Then she ran to the window to look for George, but couldn't see because the light was off in their garage. George said that he switched that light off to let his eyes adjust. When Glenda didn't see him, she suspected that he had gone to investigate the source of the noise, since he was in charge of the neighborhood watch. But it wasn't until 30 minutes or even 20 minutes later that George returned, and they had a brief conversation about what happened. And then he went into the bathroom to shower and get ready for bed. However, Glenda also told Debbie at the time that while she was waiting for George to return, she was looking out the windows of the house. And at one point, she thought she saw the silhouette of a man in her backyard. Could she have seen the killer too? For the next few weeks following George coming forward, Detective Tosi remained hanging out with him as usual, as he waited for the arrival of his new baby girl, that they eventually named Tiffany. She was born on February 24th, 1985. As Detective Tosi visited with George, he continued to gain valuable insights about his perspective on the crime. But as good of a friend as Tosi was, he was also a good detective. And there was something that stood out to him. It was the vivid description of the man George had seen. On the night of the murder, it had been dark, rainy, and foggy. Considering George was positioned near his garage, he wondered how he got such a good look at the person in David's driveway. It was under tall oak trees about 200 feet away. That was bothering him. He wanted to prove to himself that his friend really saw what he said he saw, so he could trust the information. So Tosi asked George to do a reenactment for their records, so they knew exactly where he had been when he saw the man and where the man had been standing. But what George didn't know was that Tosi had instructed another officer, who happened to have a red beard and was wearing a similar outfit to the one that George described the man wearing. He told him to discreetly exit his vehicle a block away from Karen's and David's and wait until he gave a signal over the radio. Then the officer was supposed to walk to David's driveway. This reenactment was scheduled to take place at 9:30 p.m. under very similar weather conditions to the night of Karen's murder. Tosi and George started in George's driveway in his garage, where he claimed to have been on the night of the murder when he heard the scream. If you're watching, the garage is positioned back from the road, up George's driveway, and I positioned the little Google man on the map on the road in front of it and tried to look towards David's driveway. Now, I don't know what kind of trees were blocking the view at the time or how overgrown the oak trees were, but it's pretty far away. I created this picture with an arrow pointing in the direction of where the driveway at David's would be, and maybe from George's vantage point, he could see at least into their front yard. But once in position, Detective Tosi radioed the officer to walk toward Karen's lawn. As the officer approached the point where George said the man had been standing, George told Tosi to tell him to stop. So over the radio, he instructed the officer to stop. Detective Tosi then turned his attention to George and asked him to describe the officer. However, George's description was disappointingly very vague. He could not make out specific details such as the officer's jacket color or his facial features, even though the officer was actually someone that George knew. It was Officer Brinkworth. They had known each other for years, so something wasn't adding up. But George seemed perplexed. He said, Maybe the moon was brighter that night, or maybe since it had been raining, the light from one of the street lights had been reflecting off the wet pavement and it provided more light. Or maybe it just wasn't as dark on the night that Karen was killed. But Detective Tosi knew otherwise. He did his research. He knew it was actually darker the night that Karen was killed than the reenactment. Especially because since the murder, neighbors in that area had installed spotlights in their homes outside and had started turning them on when it got dark and they went to bed. Detective Tosi knew George must have been a lot closer to the man on the night of the murder in order to be able to see him and provide such an accurate description. You remember that George had told them he walked up and down the streets? So he said, maybe you were closer. George said, yeah, I guess that's possible, but I never left my property. But he insisted he could see all the way to David's, and he added a new detail. He told Tosi he knew he could see because he had seen Karen inside earlier that night through the kitchen window. She was washing dishes around 7:30 p.m. Tosi was like, I thought you said you had never seen Karen in the neighborhood before. And George said, yeah, I hadn't before that night. Something seemed off. And in the weeks following this reenactment, Tosi had more conversations with George, and he admitted not only seeing Karen doing dishes, but that he could actually hear them clanking together. Now, noise does carry on a small street, but Tosi wasn't sure if George was just making all of this up. Was he trying to be like his own detective? Was he trying to be helpful? Or was he hiding something? But he didn't like the vibes he was getting from George. This was one of his best friends, and he realized that all these times, over all those months that he'd been investigating one of the biggest crimes that had happened in this area in his career, George had been withholding that information about the man he saw. Tosi couldn't really reconcile that he would just let him investigate this crime and not come forward with that information. But he also didn't want to believe that George would be hiding anything or covering for someone, or that he would be involved in any way in such a brutal crime. But some of the other detectives, including the police chief, were starting to think otherwise. They were pointing out inconsistencies and how George continued to change or add things to his story. But Tosi truly believed there were reasons for him doing that, like being worried and scared. But on the other hand, this man was a firefighter. He was someone used to risking his life to save other people. So that didn't really add up. Neither did his friend being involved in something so violent. He never showed any tendencies like that in the past. Plus, George was young. He was 22 years old at the time with a great career. He was good looking with a bright white smile. He was funny and friendly, had a beautiful girlfriend, now his wife, a new baby, and he was respected in their community. He grew up in Gulfport. He even went to the same high school that his wife Debbie attended. George was raised in a Catholic family with 6 other siblings. George made 7 as the youngest of them, and even went to the same church that Tosi went to, Most Holy Name of Jesus. I mean, this man was an EMT. He dreamed of being a firefighter since he was just a kid, and he was a great neighbor. He cared about people. He even helped mow elderly residents' lawns and volunteered to help when the Sunshine Sky Bridge collapsed in Tampa back in 1980. He helped people. He didn't hurt people. But maybe he knew who killed Karen. Maybe it was someone close to him, and he thought that he was helping them by not coming forward. It was odd, because he was usually the first person in the neighborhood to investigate anything suspicious, from someone new riding their bike around to someone speeding down their street. He was notorious for comments like, "Justice is never done," and "people get away with murder." The most current claim around the neighborhood since the murder was that several women had also reported seeing a strange figure or even a man in their backyards near one of their windows, just like Glenda had said. And these incidents actually started the same night that Karen was killed. It occurred at a home of 2 women. One was 32 and the other one was 19. The first incident occurred just hours after Karen was killed at around 3 a.m. on Thursday, May 24th. The 32-year-old woman called the police telling them that someone had attempted to break into her home from one of her windows. Then a few days later, on the 29th, her roommate, the 19-year-old woman, heard a noise outside her window, and when she peered out, she saw a man kneeling down, but it was too dark to tell what he looked like. Then again, the 19-year-old saw the same thing 2 days later. When she looked outside, the man took off running. One of these women referred to her encounter with this person as a peeping Tom situation, that he was looking inside her window, and she and the other woman became feeling very frightened and vulnerable. The other thing that detectives noticed was that the two women were the only other Black residents in this area besides David Mackey, Karen's boyfriend. That stood out. It made them believe that this incident was related to Karen's murder somehow, and this led detectives to wonder if someone was targeting specific residents like David and had been watching Karen before she was killed. George made it clear that it was possible to see into David's house, remember? But despite the changes in George's behavior and the suspicions surrounding his involvement in Karen's murder, there was no evidence directly linking him to the scene. It had been over 1 year now, and Detective Tosi decided to have Hansen approach George's wife, Glenda. They wanted to do this when they knew that George wasn't going to be home. They wanted to gather any additional information regarding what happened on the night of the murder. They assumed that the killer would have been covered in blood. Glenda expressed uncertainty. She stated she wasn't exactly sure what George wore that night. However, she recalled that when he was working on his motorcycle in the garage, he usually wore an old shirt and shorts, and he went barefoot. Now that was interesting. Barefoot. The prints, remember that? When Hansen asked her about telling Debbie that she saw someone outside in the backyard, she said, "No, that's not true. I only saw George that night. No one else. No stranger, no one lurking, only George walking towards the garage before he came back inside." And now she said he was only gone for 10 minutes. But in other interviews, she had said he was gone as long as 30 minutes or 20, but now it was 10. So why was her story changing too? At this point, Tosi and Hansen don't think they're the right people to be interviewing friends who are close to them. So they want someone else to interview Glenda, and they actually subpoena her to come down to the police station on June 11th. They flat out told her that because she kept changing her story and her husband kept changing his, they had no other choice but to start looking into George as a potential suspect. She was shocked. She was crying. She couldn't believe they were bringing her in there and claiming that her husband had anything to do with this murder. They were friends. They knew George wouldn't do this. But that's the thing. Hansen, and especially Tosi, started to realize that their biases might be getting in the way of really putting the pressure on George, the way that they would with a normal person of interest. There was one thing that really made Tosi decide that he needed to look deeper into George. It was the Hawaiian shirt. Remember? It was bloody and in the room. Well, he started racking his brain, and he realized that years earlier, Debbie and Glenda were both working as cashiers at Publix grocery store, and there was this Hawaiian Day where they both wore Hawaiian shirts to work. And he thought that the one he found in that room looked a lot like the one that Glenda was wearing that day. Remember how she mentioned that George would wear old clothes when he was working in his garage? Well, Tosi and other people knew from being friends with George, he also kept old clothing as rags in the garage. And that's when it hit him that maybe Glenda only purchased that shirt for a special occasion and never wore it again. So she might have given it to George to use as a rag in his garage, which meant if he was the one who killed Karen, maybe that's how it ended up in her bedroom. Maybe he had used it to conceal the knife, or maybe he was using it to open the door and not leave any fingerprints behind, because it was starting to look like George could be involved in Karen's murder. And at this point, Detective Tosi requested his superiors to remove him as lead detective from the case, but his superiors denied this request. Now the detectives undertook a thorough investigation into George's background, which they should have done from the start, because what they discovered was shocking. The detectives uncovered information that suggested there was a darker side to George's character. Of course they did. George Lewis moved to Gulfport, Florida with his family in the 1970s, and he graduated from Boca Ciega High School. After school, he worked as a welder, a construction worker, and even a grocery bagger. And in March of 1980, he became a volunteer firefighter, achieving his lifelong dream of working in this role. 2 years later, in 1982, George went through basic training at the Pinellas County Fire Academy. And after completing the training, he was stationed at Firehouse Number 9 in St. Petersburg. George's coworkers and friends described him as friendly and hardworking, dedicated to his family. However, he had a wife before Glenda, and she had a very different story to tell. She claimed that George, who she met on vacation back when he was only 18 and she was only 19, she's originally from Pittsburgh, they had a long-distance relationship. But a year later, they decided to get married, and Denise and George actually moved into the same house on 27th Avenue South, owned by his parents, actually. First, things were good. George was sweet, he was kind, he loved animals, he would even rescue kittens and other animals. But over time, Denise started to realize that he prioritized himself over her needs, one of which was just to spend more time with her. But instead of listening to her concerns, George spent the majority of his time in his detached garage, the same one we've been talking about in this case. But that time, it was him working on his pickup truck. He would be spending countless hours by himself, leaving Denise all alone in the home, bored and craving his attention. It really bothered her. But everyone else would just kind of blow it off and say, oh, give him his space. He's happy when he's working on his toys. But she thought that he was more of a spoiled brat, the youngest of the family, mama's boy. But it was another side of him that she didn't like, and it was his wandering eye. And he would do it right in front of her. If he saw a beautiful woman walking down the street, he would actually point her out to Denise and say something like, ooh, would you look at her? He was obsessed with Playboy magazines, so obsessed that when he came to visit her once, he actually had to bring along an entire box of them. And he would even exchange them with his guy friends. Another thing that was coincidental and bothersome in the past for Denise was he would push her to put on lingerie, even buying her different pieces of lingerie as well as toys to use in the bedroom. And maybe that's not a big deal for some people, but it's all about your boundaries. And for Denise, it was not something she was willing to do. In her words, it made her feel cheap. But his issues didn't stop there. Denise claimed that George was racist. He felt like he was passed over for a job at the fire station because a Black employee was hired before him. But it didn't end there. Denise said that it seemed like George was really protective over his neighborhood, especially when it came to any Black residents that were moving in, or even when he saw some Black men mowing the lawn down the street from his house. He made this disgusting comment that they better not step foot on his lawn, and he even threatened something to the effect of, let me catch them here after 9 o'clock at night, kind of insinuating that he would do something harmful to them just because of the color of their skin. And if that's not bad enough, Denise said that George had hit her several times and threatened to choke her. According to her, George had a short temper, and he would get into arguments with her when she wanted to be treated with respect. It was to the garage he would go, always retreating when he didn't feel like dealing with her. But he turned into this monster that she didn't even recognize, pushing her up against the wall and putting his hands around her neck. She said that he turned red, his eyes were bulging out of his head, and she could hardly breathe. She thought he was going to kill her. Denise, of course, needed some time away, so she went back home to be with her family. But when she came back a few weeks later, she found out that George was having a relationship behind her back with Glenda. He actually admitted to Denise that he was in love with both of them, and he didn't know what to do. Basically, Denise, who could not believe this, was like, you're wondering whether you should choose your wife over this other woman? Well, guess what? I'm leaving, so you can have her. And good for her. She stuck up for herself, and she did leave. But she wasn't done telling detectives things that they could not believe, that he was actually a self-admitted peeping Tom. Yes, he actually admitted to Denise it's like he couldn't hold back, that he actually watched one of their friends being intimate with a woman. He was watching them through their window. And he was acting like this was funny. He was talking about it like he was laughing, watching them do it. Wow, that's disgusting. But the most incriminating admission that Denise made was when she said that she was talking to George one night when they were lying in bed, and she heard a noise outside. And she asked George what she should do if she was ever home alone and someone tried to break in and attack her. At first, George suggested they get a gun, but Denise didn't like that idea. So George said, you know what? You could always use the knife that I keep in my garage. I keep an old one out there. And as they continued their conversation, Denise was asking a bunch of questions, one of which was like, if someone did come after her, there was no way they would ever get away with it. But that's when George, acting almost like he was above the law, gave her a scenario in which a killer could come in, and even if they had blood all over themselves after killing someone, all they had to do was, in the cover of darkness, wash the blood off if they could find, let's say, a faucet outside, even a hose, cleaning their clothing and the weapon, and then there would be no proof. I mean, we are talking about the 70s, early 80s at this point when he's telling the story, but why is this all sounding exactly like what happened to Karen. Someone was looking through her window. Someone like George. He even admitted to watching her wash the dishes that same night. While the detectives who thought they knew George were stunned, to say the least. This wasn't the George that they knew. But they dug even deeper, talking to more of his own colleagues and close friends from the fire station. Other younger men closer to George's age. Tosi was in his mid to later 30s, and remember, George was only 22 when the crime happened. His friends revealed that he had spoken about his desire to leave his wife Glenda and be single again, that he didn't really want her to be pregnant with their kid. And they had been arguing a lot in the weeks leading up to the crime. And even before that, Glenda had moved out for a few weeks, but was back living at George's when Karen was killed. It was reported that George had started dating numerous women and joined a swingers club. And not only that, once Glenda was out of the house for a bit, George started drinking excessively and even started hooking up with a 16-year-old girl named Tanya that lived right near the fire station. 16 years old. Once he even asked one of his buddies to have a three-way with them, but his friend said no. And recall how George claimed he had no idea who Karen was? Well, his friends claimed differently. They said one afternoon, as Karen came out of the house with a bikini on, George and some of his friends were outside. And George, being his usual outspoken self, as they claimed, he was engaging in what his friends referred to as locker room talk, and he commented that the sight of Karen had gotten him aroused. Ew. And another time, when Karen and one of her girlfriends were outside in their bikinis, one of George's friends pointed them out. And George made the comment, "Oh, I've already checked it out," referring to Karen. He was well aware that she existed, and he'd obviously been gawking at her. He even made an offhanded comment about her dating a black man. They kept digging deeper and deeper. And a woman in the neighborhood remembered having a conversation with George about how he was keeping an eye on a certain house in the neighborhood. Well, guess what house it ended up being? It was the house where the two black women lived, the 32-year-old and the 19-year-old who reported seeing a peeping Tom or a prowler. But it keeps getting worse. Then Detective Tosi learned that in George Lewis's backyard, there was a faucet. Yep. So his story to Denise years earlier about how easy it would be to get away with a murder if you were covered in blood because you could just wash it off before anyone noticed, it was all adding up. The composite sketch that George had created about the man he saw in David's yard even looked like him. The red hair, the trimmed red beard. Detective Tosi believed they had somewhat of a motive as well as a theory about how George could have committed this crime. He was friends with a lot of cops. He knew the evidence that they would be looking for at a crime scene. Also, he probably thought he could get away with it because he was so close to the authorities. But they believed that George, having been in an argument with Glenda and lusting over Karen, noticed that David was leaving town. Remember, he was always watching his neighborhood, claiming it was his job as a crime watch captain. He then devised a plan to break into Karen's house and have his way with her. But she fought back, and she fought fiercely. She did martial arts. They believe that he most likely hit her in the head first, whether it was with the glass panels on the door or just his fists, rendering her unconscious. Then he put lingerie on top of her body and had his way with her, and possibly left her there, only to come back with his knife from the garage to finish her off after realizing that she could probably identify him. And that's why Glenda saw George heading back to his garage and why he claimed he went back there at some point after hearing the scream and seeing the man. He said it was to throw things away. And, well, we'll get there. But detectives believe he went back inside and then stabbed Karen with that old knife he said he kept in his garage, then cleaned up the scene using the Hawaiian shirt he grabbed while he was in there as well to wipe away his fingerprints and straighten up the items that were knocked over. Remember, Glenda initially said that he was gone for a good 30 minutes or so after the scream? But this cover-up caused him to walk through Karen's blood, leaving a number of bare footprints inside. Then the detectives believed that George made his way to his own backyard, where he took off his clothes and used the faucet and hosed off any blood that he had on him. This is when Glenda saw that figure in their backyard. Detective Tosi suspected George disposed of his bloody clothing and the other evidence in the trash can, which he mentioned putting metal scraps into and then closing the lid when he saw the man standing under the oak tree. But because George was not considered a suspect in the days after Karen was murdered, the garbage was collected and taken to the landfill. Despite suspicions surrounding George, Detective Tosi knew that securing a conviction in court was going to require a lot of compelling evidence. He understood that forensic evidence was his best chance at bringing the perpetrator to justice, whether it was George or someone else. And one crucial piece of evidence was that partial, bloody footprint found on the tile of the bathroom floor at the crime scene. While the Florida Department of Law Enforcement expressed difficulties assisting in this bloody footprint, Detective Tosi sent it to the FBI for an expert to examine. And while waiting for the results of the forensic analysis, a profile of Karen's murderer was created, and it was determined that the killer would have had violent sexual fantasies. But the biggest case closer was the call Tosi got from John Saunders, an FBI print expert. Saunders informed Tosi that the bloody footprint on the floor of the bathroom was a match to firefighter George Lewis. He had found 30 points of comparison between the bloody print and the one belonging to George, which was considered significant. Detective Tosi felt defeated after realizing that his close friend George was guilty of murdering Karen. 4 days after he got the footprint match, he decided to go to Fire Station Number 9, where George was on duty. When Detective Tosi and his team arrived at the station, they found George dressed in his uniform, ready to go into work. Now, they didn't want to embarrass him by arresting him in front of his colleagues, but they told George that they needed him to come down to the police station one more time as a witness in Karen's murder. George tried to stall, saying that, "Can't this wait until I'm not working?" But that's when the detectives told him they already checked with his boss, and this was really important. At first, they asked him simple questions as though they were just doing a routine interview once again, but they made sure to ask George if he had ever been inside David's home, and he insisted he never stepped foot in there. That was important because they were about to confront him with the fact that his bare footprint was found in blood in the bathroom. And when they did, George said that was impossible, but they gave him the report to look at himself. And when he was done, he said, "I wasn't even barefoot that night." But the investigators were pressing him over and over again. He was making excuses like, "How would I have done this? My wife would have seen me. She would have known that I left." And they were like, "No, Glenda was asleep all night. You could have easily gone over there at any point. So how did your footprint get inside a house that you say you've never been inside?" And he kept saying that he doesn't know. I thought Detective Tosi kind of made a funny comment, but he said, "We know that someone didn't take your foot off of your body and go make that print over there." It was kind of in that moment when George realized he wasn't surrounded by friends anymore. He was surrounded by real professional investigators who were getting to the bottom of this murder. And that's when he asked for an attorney. Tosi looked at him disappointed and said, "Okay, fine. Then we're going to have to end this conversation and put you under arrest." George looked up in disbelief. But Tosi was like, "Listen, I have no other choice. All signs point to you being there and committing this murder." And that's when George suddenly says, "I saw the guy. I ran after him into David's house that night." And he started crying and hanging his head down. Are you ready to hear, what is this, his 6th or 7th or even 8th version of his story? But he said, "I didn't do this. I saw the guy. I went after him. And by the time I got in there, I saw Karen lying there with stab wounds to her neck. And the guy saw me, and that's why I ran back to my house." He said he was having nightmares about it ever since. But just like he said before, he was like, "I didn't say anything because this guy got a good look at me, and I thought he was going to come back and kill me if I spoke up." Well, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, but unfortunately for George anyway, they were going to have to arrest him regardless and let a jury decide whether he was telling the truth. George Lewis was charged with murder in the first degree and forced intercourse, and he was put in a holding cell at the Pinellas County Jail. There was outrage. When I tell you that there were so many people in this man's corner, not only was his wife standing by him, but his family, his fellow firefighters, his friends, medics, even the local priest. These people viewed George as a good man, and they believed that he had been wrongly accused. They could not believe that Detective Tosi, of all people, was doing this to him. It was almost as though they thought that he just wanted to solve the case and to look like a hero. So he was pinning this murder on someone that he used to call a friend. The state was seeking the harshest punishment possible, the death penalty. George's wife, Glenda, and their baby, Tiffany, moved out of their Gulfport home after the charges were brought against him. And when George was arrested, his coworkers at the firehouse in St. Petersburg even forfeited their vacation time to help post his bond. And in January of 1987, George was released on bond after his mother raised enough money to pay the 10% required. The Tampa Bay Times published a 4-part series on Karen's murder and George's arrest. It was entitled A Cry in the Night. The media coverage was very significant. Defense attorneys representing George even sought to have the trial moved out of Pinellas County because of all of the negative impact the media coverage would have on the jurors. They argued that the extensive coverage had tainted the jury pool. At first, the judge denied this motion, and jury selection began in March of 1987 for George's trial. However, due to a significant amount of people who were potential jurors who read the 4-part series A Cry in the Night, the judge eventually decided to move the trial to Polk County, where the media coverage had not been as extensive. So on June 2nd of 1987, the trial began. And I want you to hear this part. I know people will sometimes leave. Don't, because this is when a lot of stuff starts to be uncovered. According to the state, George, angry after having fought with his girlfriend, noticed David was away, and he turned his attention and aggression towards Karen. The state alleged that George devised a twisted plan to gain access to Karen's home, and he made his move. However, Karen rejected George's advances, which angered him, and then George forced her into intercourse and later murdered her to eliminate her as a witness. On the other hand, the defense argued that George's changing statements to the police during the investigation did not prove he was guilty. They maintained that Karen most likely had consensual sex with someone else prior to her death. As the trial progressed, the state called Tanya, one of the first witnesses. And remember me mentioning her? She was the 16-year-old. Well, at the time that Tanya testified, she was a 19-year-old secretary. But at the time of Karen's murder, she was a 16-year-old girl dating their prime suspect, George Lewis. Tanya said she first met George within 2 weeks of Karen's murder, and throughout their relationship, Tanya admitted to lying to George about her age, and she was portraying herself as in her early 20s. But eventually, Tanya claimed that George did learn that she was underage, and he kept seeing her. Tanya said that she and George frequently went swimming and camping. However, there were also instances where George's racist comments became very apparent to Tanya. He expressed to Tanya that he did not approve of his fire department hiring individuals that he referred to as N-words. He even voiced his disapproval towards the idea of interracial couples. He expressed his discomfort on seeing such a sight. So keep that in mind. On the witness stand, Tanya testified that one night, while they were camping together, the topic of Karen's murder actually came up. And George, without hesitation, pointed the finger at David, Karen's boyfriend. According to George, David should have known better than to leave Karen all alone. He argued that David should have recognized the dangerous nature of their neighborhood, whatever that means. Tanya testified that when she turned 17, she and George planned a trip, and out of a bag of camping equipment, George pulled out a white lingerie teddy. According to Tanya, she wore this teddy frequently because George loved it so much. He would request it so often. Now, Tanya couldn't remember if there were tags on the teddy when George gave it to her, but claimed it looked new. Detective Tosi was positive that this white teddy that George gifted to his underage girlfriend was the one he stole from David's home on the night Karen was killed. Following Tanya's testimony, David Mackey took the stand. Although it had only been a few years since Karen's murder, David appeared significantly aged, with his face displaying signs of weathering and his hair had turned gray. David testified that the white teddy that Tanya handed over to the detectives was a match for the one Karen had purchased for herself in March before her murder. However, George's defense team claimed that George had bought the teddy brand new for Tanya, despite the lack of evidence of a receipt. And during the witness testimony of Naverne, Karen's friend, who was the last person to see her alive before her murder, George's defense attorney attempted to paint Karen, the murder victim, in a really negative light. He focused on bringing up various details regarding Karen's lifestyle, including her cannabis use, her alcohol consumption, and her interest in reggae music and going to clubs. They attempted to portray Karen as a deviant and promiscuous woman who might have deserved what happened to her. Blatant victim blaming, even making her look like she brought this on herself. George's defense attorneys argued that Peter was the perpetrator of the crime. They contended that Peter's desire for more than a friendship escalated into violence when Karen turned him down, leading to her attack and her murder. On June 12th, George Lewis testified in his own defense. What a surprise. And now he was presenting a new version of events surrounding the night that Karen was killed. Wow, he's quite the storyteller. According to George, that night he wore a combination of clothing to keep him protected from any potential burns while working with a welder in his garage. George had on a t-shirt and shorts, a long-sleeve flannel, and jeans. He also mentioned his boots were causing him discomfort, so he took them off. When George discovered that his footprint had been found in the bathroom, he obviously changed this version of the story. Remember, at first he said, "Oh, but I didn't go over there barefoot." But now he did. He claimed that he had gotten sick after seeing Karen covered in blood, dead on the floor, and he ran into the bathroom to vomit. However, later, when Detective Tosi testified, he revealed that the footprint was approximately 6 feet away from the toilet. Additionally, he pointed out that the toilet bowl in the bathroom had been flushed, which meant that if George had vomited, he would have still had the wherewithal to flush the toilet before fleeing the scene. But still, he didn't seek any help for Karen, and he was an EMT and a firefighter. George claimed that the reason he did not seek help for Karen was because he could tell she was already dead. Even though he admitted on the witness stand that he was the neighborhood crime watch captain, he said that his duties usually just meant mowing lawns and looking after the elderly residents, not fighting crime. According to George, when he found Karen murdered, it was unlike anything he had ever seen. George feared that he could actually get pinned for the murder, and that's why he chose not to alert the police. He denied taking anything from Karen's home or touching her body when he was inside that house. Glenda, George's wife, took the stand as well and testified in his defense, standing by her man. By this point, since George had been out on bail, Glenda was pregnant with their second child. And during her testimony, she claimed that on the night of Karen's murder, she noticed that George looked paler than usual. But other than that, he seemed perfectly normal. And during the trial's recess, George took advantage of the opportunity to spend some quality time with his wife and their young daughter, Tiffany. The prosecution, they were really afraid that the sight of George with his family would make the jury sympathetic. I can't even believe they allowed that. They should have probably been doing that outside of the jury. But he believed that seeing this family man with a loving wife and a child could sway the jury's decision and that he would be acquitted for the murder of Karen. However, the state's worries proved to be unfounded because after 2 days of intense deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. George Lewis was convicted for the murder and sexual violation of Karen Gregory. The news came as a shock to Glenda. She screamed in anguish. Witnessing her mother's distress, George's 2-year-old daughter, Tiffany, also began to cry. Several friends testified at George's sentencing hearing that he was a compassionate family man, and Glenda spoke highly of her husband, that he had a good character, and emphasized his exceptional qualities as a father. However, instead of pronouncing George's sentence, the judge presiding over the case reversed George's convictions. In his opinion, there were too many things that went awry during the trial, leading to an unfair outcome, and I was stunned. George's supporters were celebrating this news. They were thrilled by this decision. But on the other hand, those who loved Karen were devastated. However, George's friends and family's happiness was short-lived, because within just 18 months, the Court of Appeals reinstated George's conviction. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, thankfully. And on February 8th, 1988, George's wife, Glenda, gave birth to their second daughter they named Brittany. And interestingly, in November of 1997, a Seattle transient man named Clark Morris actually confessed to murdering Karen Gregory, but records indicated that Clark wasn't even in Florida at the time she was killed. I don't know why people admit to things they didn't do, but we've gone over that in other cases. In 2009, George Lewis contacted the Florida Innocence Project, hoping that advances in DNA testing would prove his innocence in Karen Gregory's murder. However, the DNA test results did not yield the information that George had hoped for. The Orchid Cellmark Labs in Dallas, Texas, which conducted the test, determined that George could not be excluded as a donor to the male DNA found at the crime scene. And in June of 2010, the Florida Parole Commission offered George Lewis parole on the condition that he would be released in 2051 at the age of 89. However, George never actually had the opportunity to take advantage of that offer, because the Tampa Bay Times reported that in December of 2015, George died in the correctional institution in Daytona Beach at 52 years old. I could not find a cause of death. I looked, but does it really matter? David Mackey claimed that it took a very long time for him to heal after the tragic loss of Karen. As a trained therapist, he even sought out counseling for himself, attempting to cope with his grief and his loss. Today, David has become an advocate for victim support groups, and since Karen's passing, David has struggled to find another love that matches the intensity of his feelings for Karen. He believes that he will never be able to experience that kind of love again. Karen's family holds the belief that she would forgive George for murdering her because that's the type of person she was. Roy, Karen's brother, still wears a ring that she made for him, and it became a constant reminder of the love and the bond that they shared. The big takeaway for me in this case is that this is the third or fourth case involving someone in a position of authority who used their position to manipulate an investigation and possibly even use their position to murder a vulnerable person. And that's bothersome. And it should bother you that there are people that exist in our communities, people that are hiding behind their badges or their status and using that to gain other people's trust. I also noticed that there were a lot of threads on Reddit talking about how people didn't think that George was actually guilty. And I don't know what to say about that because from everything that I read, it's pretty clear that he did this. You always have to think about the motive, the means, and the opportunity. And of course, the scientific evidence with the footprint. I would love to get your thoughts. Just please make sure to keep them respectful because you never know. The family of the victim could be watching one of these videos. Thank you so very much for being here today for Karen's story. I will see you in my next video. Bye.